Okay, so we have three of our speakers here, so I'll let them introduce themselves one at a time and then tell you a little bit about their K-12 so that you can hear a little bit about it. And then I wanted them to focus on trying to kind of make you feel comfortable that this is a grant mechanism that you should think about. And, you know, a lot of you are at a stage where you may be moving institutions. You may go in the first time and not get it. You may have a very clinical project. So I picked people that have the K-12. This is by far not everyone that has a K-12. So they're usually between 4 and 5, maybe even 6 a year. So each person listed here has successfully gotten the K-12, and they all have done it in different ways. So they're kind of a diversity group. So I'll let them introduce themselves. Booma, you're first on my screen. You want to start?
Yeah, thanks. I'm Booma Arabamuddin. I'm at WashU. I'm an assistant professor at WashU. I just, I'm finishing the K-12 and transitioning to a K-08. And my research is in the basic science realm. I'm interested in the pathophysiology of dystonia after neonatal brain injury. And for the K-12, I study that in rat and mouse models of neonatal brain injury. Do you want me to go into like the whole, the path and when
No,
okay.
I think you can just introduce yourselves and then we'll, I have sort of some big topic areas. But I want the crowd to ask questions too. So yeah, that was great. Thanks. Michael, you're next up on my list.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the invitation to be here, Dr. Porter and Amber, for helping to coordinate. So actually, I was awarded the K-12, but actually got the KOA around the same time. So I picked the KOA obviously because it's longer funding. But so I got it on the third shot, so I know how to do the application. And I can give you any feedback that you want on that. And, you know, I'm happy to talk about my experiences. So my name is Mike Lopez, assistant professor at UAB in Children's of Alabama. I'm a peds neuromuscular specialist, and I focus in the lab on Duchenne muscular dystrophy using mouse and cell culture models of dystrophinopathies. And we're probing a SMAD, TGF-beta transcription factor and its role in modulating microRNAs and how they might make the disease worse.
Thank you. Jennifer, you're on my screen.
Yeah, can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yay. So my name's Jennifer Ranelovich, and I'm an assistant professor at University of Colorado, affiliated with their Children's Hospital. I am involved with translational research. So my K-12 is for looking at kind of neuroimaging and clinical aspects of development in the trans female population, comparing it to a cisgender male population with respect to development of headache. So I'm a pediatric neurologist subspecializing in headache. Is that everything?
Yeah, that's perfect, I think. I see one other new name on the list. Joshua, we did introduce ourselves or before you got on, I think. You don't have to, obviously.
Hi, I'm Josh Smith. I am a child neurology resident at Texas Children's Hospital, along with Jay, who I guess you guys met earlier during your introductions, working on oligonucleotide biology in the setting of hypoxic ischemic injury.
Oh, okay, welcome. Okay, so one of the topics that I wanted to go over was when you submitted your Ks and how you picked your project. So kind of going back to the beginning part of it, kind of like the project development, the mentor selection, and you know, when you decided you were ready to submit. So you guys can choose, or well, you can't talk all at once, obviously, but feel free to. Booma, you want to start since you're up at the top?
We can just go in the same order, I guess. So I applied for the K-12 6 months into my R25, and I used the preliminary data that I got from the R25 to inform the K-12. So I stuck with the same mentors that I had for my R25, and it was an extension. The K-12 ended up being kind of the next step of the R25 project.
Okay. And that would have been then, when you say 6 months in your R25, you would have finished
Yeah.
your child neurology or your movement disorder, or what was that?
Submitted the K-12 letter of intent at the end of my PGY5 year.
Okay.
Yeah. And so I interviewed for the K-12 and got it in my PGY6 year, which would have been my first full year of the R25, if that makes sense.
I believe so.
Okay.
So you did not do a clinical movement disorder fellowship?
No, I did clinics during that R25 year. So my PGY6 year was R25 plus the extra 20%, I believe it's 20% that you're allowed clinical effort on the R25 was all movement disorder clinics, but it was officially R25 time.
Okay, very good, very good. Michael?
Yeah,
Before we leave Booma, sorry
Yeah.
if I forgot to mention this, but or if you already mentioned this, didn't you have to move your money from institution to institution or something?
Yeah, so I'm happy to get into that now. So that was a very circumscribed answer to the prompt. So to get in a little bit deeper, around the same time I was applying for the K-12, I was also applying for jobs. So the mentors I listed on the K-12 were my mentors at Boston Children's and Mass Gen, which is where I did residency and my R25. And then I ended up, during the K-12, I was interviewing in a variety of positions. And after I was awarded the K-12 before I decided on a position. And then after I was awarded the K-12, decided to take a faculty position at WashU, and then transferred the funding to WashU under new mentors with a comparable project, actually, maybe slightly shifted, but really the same project, just under new mentors at WashU.
Sorry, I just made you talk about that because I feel like it's very germane to people at this training level.
Yeah, I was definitely going to get into that, but it's good. You did the same or did something similar, so we'll all go through that hopefully. Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, and I think everyone's situation is going to be a little complicated, right? Because we're all taking pretty unique pathways. But for me, I had just finished fellowship, and I have a long-standing interest in Duchenne's and muscle disease research. So I had a scientific area, and that was like piece one for how I picked. Really, I was picking two things. I was really picking institution to have my first after fellowship job, and in mentors who could, be, the key mentors for my, independent pathway. And so I found, there were several places where I knew there were mentors who had the expertise and who I felt like I would have a good rapport with. And so I think that was kind of my guiding focus is there a mentor who I know I can work with, who has interests similar to what I was looking to do, and in an environment that would be supportive. And so that was how that was kind of like the guiding piece. And then I added on the other, because obviously this is mostly science and a little bit of clinic, right? And so then you have to take into your clinical appointment. And as I was looking at different places, I realized that there were some places that maybe there was going to be a broader kind of safety net. And so anyway, so I found I was lucky enough to find mentors here at UAB and at Children's who had the expertise that I was seeking, and who were interested in having a mentee. So that was important too. And when I interviewed with them, we came up with a project. The specifics of the actual project didn't come up until I landed in the position, but I kind of knew the areas that they were in, and that I would have the opportunity to pursue Duchenne research. And so I think that was so flexible in terms of the actual project, the details themselves. So I'll just leave it there.
Very helpful. Jennifer?
Yeah, so I've been interested in this area of research since undergrad and involved with it. So in terms of choosing a research project, a lot of it was very self-driven rather than mentor-driven. And in fact, I chose my clinical subspecialty of headache partly because I thought it would be an ideal population in which to study sort of the neurodevelopment of sex differences as driven by sex steroids, because there's a big sex difference in prevalence of headache and migraine. And I was more interested in neuroimaging people with fairly typical looking brains rather than, you know, very idiopathically injured brains, you know, such as kids with stroke, for instance. And so that was partly the way that I chose my research. And then similarly to Michael, during my fellowship year, I was sort of building a spreadsheet looking at people who might have mentorship that intersected with my research interests. So I had, you know, and my research is very intersectional. So I was looking for people with experience in like neuroimaging of pain, neuroimaging of sex differences, neuroimaging of headache, you know, any kind of that. And then also with Michael, you know, mentioning the clinical aspects, for me, I needed a place where I could recruit the appropriate clinical population. So looking only at places to interview that had a substantially sized pediatric transgender clinic with people who are interested in working with me on my research project. So I kind of had this project, specific project idea during fellowship. And the first thing
What fellowship did you do? Sorry, you didn't mention that. You did a headache fellowship.
Yeah, so I was out in Boston doing headache. Yeah, so was looking for a faculty position that would facilitate me doing this, and mentors that would facilitate me doing this idea. So the first K I applied for was actually a Birch, which is sort of like the CNCDP used to be. You know, it was money parceled out to different academic institutions, and then you would apply within your institution. So kind of like the old ENSADA. And that one is for sex differences research. So, you know, I basically, when I didn't get that one, that was my first time ever applying for a K, I took pretty much the same idea and then decided to go after child development funding because it's the neurodevelopmental aspects of this sex difference. And I was very much, you know, prompted to do so by a mentor at University of Colorado, Amy Brooks-Kyle, who's since left. And she was one of the, I think is the official term, she's a co-director along with Brad of the program.
Sure.
Anyway.
Sure.
Yeah, I was like, I don't know what the name is. And the fact that we had an ENSADA scholar at the institution. So I felt like I had kind of a roadmap for applying for this funding. But I also applied for like the AAN Career Development Award at the same time. So we just like was taking the same concept to see, you know, who, shopping it around to see who would be interested in funding it, basically. Was that all the aspects of the prompt?
Yeah, I think that was very helpful because I think I didn't realize this, but the one person that was supposed to be on the committee hasn't shown up yet, stayed at her home institution, but all of you have moved, which I hadn't exactly planned on, but I do think it really clarifies that you went out and you found the location that fit your needs. And I think that you very clearly specified your needs: mentors, support of the division of the institution to your careers. So I think that that was lovely. One question about the mentor issue is often comes up. You know, we all have lots of mentors, right? Like everybody does. The question comes up, how many mentors? How did you decide that someone met the criteria to be elevated to a K12 mentor, like officially on your application? So Buma, do you have any thoughts on that?
So picking mentors for the K12 was I guess picking mentors for the R25 was an interesting process, and transitioning that to the K12 was an interesting process. So I say that because one of my R25 mentors left Boston for Hopkins right as the R25 was awarded, and she was supposed to be my main PI. So I was in flux with the R25 as I was thinking about writing the K12 letter of intent. And the person who was supposed to be kind of like my side PI became my main PI, I think out of the goodness of his heart. But he also, I mean, he's still a key mentor figure in my professional life. And just having his help, I guess, working on the letter of intent, crafting a new project, just how supportive he was when I was in a position where I could have easily floundered and dropped off, to be honest, I think was a great indicator that he should be, you know, elevated to the position of a K-12 mentor. I also think about, I think a lot of us have mentor teams. I think like Jennifer was also talking about, our research is, if you have a research project and you want it to be uniquely yours and you want it to set your path towards independence, it is going to be very rare to do that in a single lab at this just the way science works these days. So when I developed my question, which was on for the K-12, it was on identifying patterns of brain injury that was associated with dystonia. I needed to find someone who was really great at animal motor behavior characterization, somebody who was a neonatal brain injury expert, somebody who was very good at like histological characterization and neuronal structure mapping and that sort of expertise. So I had 3 different groups of mentors that formed a mentor team for the K-12. So I think when you think about your application, thinking about the skills that you need to be trained on, it is a career development application, and thinking about whether your mentors fit each of those skills, like thinking about how you write your training plan, like your gap-based training plan. These are the gaps in my training. Gap 1, this mentor. Gap 2, this mentor. Gap 3, this mentor. So I think that's having that mindset about picking K-12 mentors or career development award mentors is valuable.
One question, did you ask them, and if you did ask them, how did you find out their NIH funding?
I went on NIH Reporter.
Okay, so you didn't actually ask them.
No,
Okay.
no, yeah, I stalked, yeah, that's a really good point. So yeah, so in picking mentors, it's important to pick mentors that can pay you. So I look for, I mean, in some mentors, the person who became my primary mentor is not in child neurology. And I honestly did not know him very well, really, until like I asked him to be a secondary mentor for the R25. So I NIH Reporter stalked him, and he's, you know, he's chair at BI at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center now for neurology. So he's no slouch. It's just that I didn't know him at the time. So I NIH Reporter stalked him and saw that he was incredibly well funded. And the other mentors are just, they're big names in the field. So one of my other mentors for the K-12 was Ann Young, who, as
Heard
you know,
her.
Yeah, you may have heard of Ann Young. And the other person was Hannah Kinney, who is quite a big name in neonatal brain injury, and came as a recommendation to me from Joe Volpe when I was talking to him about who the other person should be to kind of flesh out the mentor team. So yeah.
Michael?
Yes, I agree that to echo that point, I think we probably all have done this. Make sure that your mentor has longstanding success of winning, career awards or NIH funding. So there may be some who have other funding like clinical trials and things like that, but so that might be appropriate too. But either way, it needs to be more of a long-standing one. And so when I was looking for mentors, I looked at my local institution, and I met with potential mentors at the local where I could, and I had a meeting and we talked about what my plans were, and so that's what I would recommend is if you can do in-person kind of first find out who's potential mentors, like we talked about, read their articles, you probably know some names in the field just by virtue of being doing the science itself. And then it went to the next step is to basically to the institutions that were interested in having physician scientists. And so so at the institutions where there was an interest, then I went and actually I met with the mentors where I was interviewing. in person and did several visits to meet the mentors because I knew that was going to be a key step. And so, kind of fast forwarding to UAB, I had one mentor who I was interested in working with, who had worked with Luke Hunkel, speaking of names in the field, who discovered the dystrophin mutation locus in '87. And so his postdoc was here at UAB, and I was very interested in working with him, but he's a little bit junior. And so, you know, not quite yet with the first R01, but I mean, you know, he was strong in terms of his, you know, he was the guy who understood Duchenne and basic science and was just done his postdoc, went to UT for PhD as well. So, I mean, total whiz. So I was very excited to work with him and learn from him. But I did need someone who was a little bit more experienced and who had trained other people. So I needed that sort of wisdom, and that's where my second mentor came in, and that was something that I had to flesh out when I came here to UAB. And so we strategized by email about who I could potentially meet with, and actually interviewed with several other, like, quote, senior mentors as well. And then Peter King ended up being my senior mentor. And so we kind of, we fit very nicely when we met, and you know, he had the long track record of publications and R01 funding, and so that's kind of how that worked. And we have been fortunate, and it was a very stable mentor dyad, and so that's been nice because, you know, with every application, you know, it kind of stays the same, so I don't have to make a lot of changes in terms of adding people and subtracting people, and that's helpful because they know you well, they can refine your letters a little bit better and kind of make those points that those you know, details that matter.
Thanks. That's great. Jennifer?
So I'm going to share a screen with you so you can see my wacky thought process. So, can everybody see my weird
I love it.
Yeah. So, this is like literally.
I love it. This is being recorded. I just want to warn you.
I looked, and there's nothing like weird here, but basically, when I was
standalone small, I love it. I'm going to tell my boss that.
And like scroll.
Sorry, I shouldn't laugh. But.
No, it's okay. And part of that. Yeah. So some of this might be out of date. Like, I think it was standalone small when I interviewed for medical school.
There are days when I wish it was much smaller.
But anyway, yeah. So I kind of thought about what I cared about, and really what I wanted to focus on was like this part right here. So I was like, oh, I need that to be a neuroimaging hub, to have pain neuroimaging, you know, mentorship, endocrine mentorship, sex differences, neuroimaging mentorship, and a gender clinic. And so it was like, okay, you know, I kind of like Booma was like going online and trying to figure out, okay, who's big in the field, you know, looking at their lab websites, looking at what they've published, you know, see if they're doing stuff up my alley. And then, you know, I would kind of say, is this somebody who really wants to work with me? Or somebody who, you know, is like very central to what I want to do. And then I, you know, color coded it based on that.
So green is a go, yellow is a maybe, and red is a no-go.
Yeah, and it had to do with like, congruence or prominence in the field, you know, if I knew them already personally. And then similarly to what Michael said, I would, when I actually got to the point of interviewing somewhere, I said, okay, I'm going to be here for 1 or 2 days. I need you to arrange interviews for me with XYZ. So when I interviewed for my faculty position, I was also interviewing with potential mentors very explicitly. And then, you know, with the gender clinic as well, to make sure, you know, everybody would be interested in and supportive of my research and say, yes, I either want to mentor you or I don't want to mentor you. This is really like actually what neuroimaging here is like, you know, all of that.
That's great. I mean, basically what Booma and Michael said was the same idea without the color coding. I mean, to me, do you guys agree?
That was much more detailed and organized. I love it.
I love it. I want a copy.
Yes.
So I think that is
But let me echo one thing
key.
before I forget. To Jennifer's point, those places that did not make the mentors available for the interview, I shied away from.
Mm, mm.
Because if they couldn't meet you within a reasonable time, then how much time do they have for you, really?
Right,
going
and
forward.
how supportive of research is that institution?
So I think this is fantastic. I think that COVID has thrown a huge wrench in. I'm right now in charge of the search for the adult epilepsy chair and at Stanford. And we have had to do all our interviews remotely because, well, it's improving, but right now you can't really bring somebody to campus. It's kind of on the edge. Probably we can again soon, but so I'm just curious if anybody on this has been interviewing via Zoom. I'm just kind of curious how that is making things better, worse, challenging. Because I would assume that you then have a wider, like you're not there for 2 days. You're there for whatever it takes to kind of get to know the place. It doesn't look like anybody's shaking their head that they've been out interviewing yet. No.
Yeah, I guess we should specify this was all these, as far as I know, are pre-pandemic, so it was all flights.
Yeah, different world.
One of my co-residents, though, who was interviewing this year, though, found it a little more trying because people actually would keep bringing them back. So they met everyone once, and then they're like, "Oh, now come back for the real interview, and you have to meet and do it all over again." So I think it's maybe it was because it was sort of the initial, because she's graduating this year, like early on in the pandemic when she was starting to look about a year out. She had to meet with everyone, and then they sort of redid it when it actually came for letters. So that was one of the challenges I heard this way.
Interesting. Okay, so I want to open it up to questions, but the one thing that we didn't talk about, so maybe we can do this relatively quickly, is how you wrote your grant when you were busy. Like, we're all busy always when we're writing grants, but how do you find the time to be efficient and to get a good grant out the door? So Buma, we'll start with you. Especially for the K-12, like how did you manage all that?
Well, I think, so I will say that writing the K-12 was, I already had protected time on the R25. So I wrote it piecemeal over several weeks, and then the 2-ish weeks maybe leading up to the submission deadline for the final grant. So maybe I should back up. So whenever writing a grant, you have your aims, specific aims page comes first. And that if I'm thinking about a submission date several months down the line, I'm thinking about aims several months prior to that submission date. And if you have your aims set, you can think, what are the experiments I need to do to get the preliminary data that I need to get this grant out of the door? And then from that starting point, you can develop kind of a timeline for this experiment needs to be done by this time, this data needs to be available by this time, so I can have this figure ready for the grant by this date. So I timed it out in that way, with the idea that the last several days leading up to the deadline would be spent either with some figure making, data analysis, or just straight up grant writing. So that's how I did it. I was lucky to be able to do that because I already had protected time to do it. Now I'm still on protected time, but the grants, I think grants get easier to write the more of them that you write, obviously. And in addition to that, you can, all of your grants aren't going to get accepted. So it's easy to kind of cannibalize things from some grants and recycle them for the next mechanism. So once you've written your first few grants, those grants will help you become much more efficient at writing grants subsequently. But the K-12 was a big I will say it was a big effort for me, and was, you know, it was several days of dedicated, I'm just going to focus on the grant kind of work. And then planning for several months leading up to that.
Interesting. Preliminary data is not needed for all of you that are thinking, oh my God, don't worry. It's not needed. It's good to have, but you don't need it. So, okay, Michael.
And yes, so I think that's a hard question, but I think to Booma's point, the practice makes perfect. So my first year, I was junior faculty getting up. Took about a month or two for the first clinics to even start, you know, operating. So what I did in that first year, I submitted 5 applications, and you know, they weren't perfect by any means, but they definitely got better as I went. And so, and actually one of them was a loan repayment program, for example, just for, and that got funded. So I was pretty pleased about that. And then after the first year, I think I did another 2 or 3. And I love that analogy of cannibalizing your old grants and using different pieces. And it really does make sense that way, because you kind of deconstruct your grants, and then you're like, okay, this was the critique and this is how I'm going to change it. And it really gets your creative juices flowing in terms of how you can structure the next one. So I think that's a good point too. So practice makes perfect. Don't let it be the perfect be the enemy of good enough, right? So not everything is going to be perfect that's funded. And then protected time. So obviously I was, you know, I was, so one of the things that when I mentioned about support is that I knew I was going to have some protected time. So I was only doing 25% clinical time. And so that allowed me to have that incubation period to get funding.
Jennifer?
So I didn't per se have a lot of protected time when I wrote this. I was doing a full-time research fellowship, and I forgot, you know, even before I applied for the Birch, I think I applied for like a National Migraine Foundation or some kind of national or international headache nonprofit grant that was also like career development or something. So for a very first iteration of this, I kind of did for that, and then a few months later the Birch, and then a few months later the CNCDP-K12. And so, you know, I applied for this in a, you know, naive optimism without a lot of mentorship, because I knew I wasn't staying in Boston. And I knew somebody that had their own lab. So I kind of asked like, hey, you ever applied for a grant? Of course they had. Can I take a look at what that looks like? I also had some good resources in Boston, so I could do, you know, kind of think through the power calculations and do the stats part of my application. So for fellows there, and you kind of have to like search this kind of thing out. But for residents and fellows there, you could have access to biostat support, you know, to do small projects. And so I kind of said, hey, do you mind helping me think through this and come up with some numbers? So that resource was available. You know, a little bit of, you know, research / admin time during my fellowship. And yeah, then I just took a whack at it. I mean, you kind of have to know that it's going to take a few go rounds. So the first one obviously didn't get funded, nor the second go round. But as Booma said, you kind of recycle stuff, get lots of different people to take a look at it. I mean, I had headache mentorship there, and even though they knew they wouldn't be the eventual, you know, headache mentor, they were awesome and took a look at it and gave me some advice on language. I think one of the and then, you know, once I knew I was at University of Colorado and applying for the CNCDP, I kind of had my actual mentors, you know, chosen, and they definitely helped me move this forward, you know, as an application. But also, as Booma mentioned, I mean, I was like applying for this stuff like a very short notice, not ideal. I think the letter of intent for this thing was due, when is it due? Like
June.
Okay, yeah, I was still in fellowship when I filed the letter of intent for this thing. I wasn't at University of Colorado, but I had accepted the position. And then I had to submit it something like 2-3 months after I landed there. I had asked for supported research time in the absence of a grant, which I did have. So the final push to submit the K-12 once I was at University of Colorado, I had a fair amount of supported research time, but the initial iterations of this, I really didn't.
Okay. All right. So we only have 20 minutes left if we're going to stick to our assigned time. So I want to open it up. And Nick Abreu joined us late, but we did all introduce ourselves. I don't know if you want to say hello. You don't have to. Waiting to see if his little, no. Okay. All right. Oh, no mic. Oh, okay. Hello. So feel free to ask some questions. And Nick, if you want to ask questions, you can type them in there and I'll pay attention. So do you guys have some questions for everyone? I'm not going to call on anyone, so I'll just look for your little mic thing to go.
I have a question.
Oh, sure.
Go. I was wondering about publications prior to applying, both related to the project that you're working on or like a prior publication record.
You want us to take that? Like what we
Well,
had?
I just was, you can say like whether you had it or not, and then I can comment on maybe a broader overview, but go ahead.
Okay. The preliminary data was ready to go for a publication, but it was not, and it wasn't, it was in the process of being written. I didn't have it under review or anything like that. In terms of previous publications, I'm MD PhD. My PhD was not in this topic area. But I will say in residency, I had done I had a basic science EPhys paper that was relevant it was done in a model of cardiac arrest, in an early model of rat cardiac arrest, which was relevant to this application. And I did a meta-analysis during neurology residency, which provided kind of the significance and knowledge gap that I was trying to address in this application. So that was what I had.
Mike?
Yeah. So my PhD was in muscular dystrophy, so I had a lot of publications from that. But one of the critiques I got from feedback from my applications is, the dearth of first author papers. So, but I was still able to make the case that the using my old publications for PhD work, that I was, so the question that they said is not productive. So what I said is, you have to look at the time that I was at the bench and look at the papers that came out of the bench time and then compare that to the clinical time. But other reviewers in the same, K08 review also said, kind of made the point that they kind of looked at that, but they said, appropriate for level of, clinical training, et cetera. So they did want to see, but I think they did look at the clinical publications too. So I think that's important, and it's going to the question of productivity. So did you have that academic kind of spirit? But like Booma, my prelim data is still not enough for a full paper on the current project, for which I submitted all the applications. And so that wasn't a necessity, but I think you have to burnish up what you do have, and where possible, show that you're productive.
Jennifer?
So as I mentioned, I've been involved with research in this area since undergrad. I don't think I had many or any first author publications as papers, but many second author publications from undergrad and med school. So I had a significant amount of time that I was able to set aside for research. And for all of them, I was like integrally involved with designing and or executing the methods. So I think I could point to kind of being prepared as a researcher to do more neuroimaging stuff. The training, the career development part of this was sort of moving into the data gathering, because I was doing secondary analyses on already collected neuroimaging data during my training, and now I'm, you know, branching out to actually recruit people and gather the data and then analyze it. So gaining some facility with clinical trials in a sense, investigator-initiated clinical trials. At any rate, I did in a sense have preliminary data because I did a paper, 2 papers in undergrad that I was involved with on cisgender adolescents and looking at sex steroids and how those, you know, correlated with brain development. And then during my fellowship year, I got to work with retrospective chart review on transgender adolescents. So, you know, had some preliminary data from both of those. As Michael said, not a ton of first author stuff, but I think it was enough to establish, you know, productivity and knowledge of the area, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that if anybody is coming into this without a background in research or a background in the field that they're now working in, I think that's okay. I would say that that alone will not prevent you from getting the grant. It may bleed over into your ability to write a clear grant because you just don't have that experience. So I think that sometimes they are interconnected issues, but there's a pretty strong push. I was on NST1 study section, which is the K for NINDS study section, and there's a pretty strong push to not require preliminary data or not require prior publications. I wouldn't say that it doesn't seep into the issue a little bit, but it's not going to prevent you from getting the grant. So if you have a really good idea and you flesh that out in a clear way and you have good mentorship, I think that third pillar of you and your prior productivity can be held up by the other 2 pillars, your science and your mentors. So, you know, it's kind of a balance. So don't feel like you shouldn't submit because you don't have something. I struggle with this in trying to advise. Like, I just got one of the R25s I'm helping with. He wants to wait because he doesn't have a publication in this area. However, he has like 15 first author publications. And I'm like, I don't know. I think that seems like you shouldn't just wait for that. Like, it's not like an R. It's, you know, it's a career development. So perfection can be an enemy of, you know, accomplishment, because you may have to go back in, right? And he's gonna hit that wall. Like, if he doesn't have something and he has to go back in, he's got a gap. So all things to think about.
So sort of following up on that too, in terms of talking about productivity and whether it be the clinical papers, but when it's sort of more abstract. So like I got involved with the QI project, which is stroke assessment after cardiac cath. And I've actually like 2 papers where I'm second author on that. And we're trying to finish up a third where I'd be first author. But at the same time, it's sort of, you know, coming away from where I am. So how do you sort of highlight that without it being a detractor? Because that was one of, in my first K12 is sort of like an application. One of the comments was about my productivity. And so I didn't highlight the stroke stuff. I'm sure they saw it on my NCBI, like my bibliography, if they looked at it, that thing, but I didn't highlight it so much because it wasn't working with like in line with my basic science and where I was going with that.
I would highlight anything that shows that.
You're a little quiet, Michael.
Oh, can you hear me okay? It's not that good. I'll talk louder. I would highlight anything that shows that you can write and think about the data and synthesize it. And then that includes clinical case reports or anything that's peer reviewed and published where your lead author demonstrates that you have the ability to do that skill. And that's kind of, I think, the key, what most people are looking for.
I would echo that. And Catherine, can you remind me, what is the topic? What's the general basic science research area you're interested in?
So working in TSC associated epilepsy, but specifically like my K12 proposal is looking at the role of inhibitory parvalbumin interneurons in TSC itself.
Okay, and all of the clinical papers are stroke related?
Yeah, 2 are stroke. I was like a very buried middle author and something else, but I have 1 review that I wrote on TSC during this time, but otherwise I don't have any basic science, and my PhD stuff is all in like NMDA AMPA receptors.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, I think the theme that's coming from this is spin, right? So I've talked to other people about this on this call. I've talked to other people about this, about how sometimes you don't realize what your strengths are until someone else points them out to you. So what I'm hearing from you is that you have a lot of basic science experience in you know, in receptor neurophysiology and in that aspect. So that's a check mark. So I would highlight your PhD papers and think about ways to tie those skills and that background into the K12. And it sounds like you've written a TSC review, which I would cite vociferously in this application as like the source for your significance section. You know, why is this significant? I know because I wrote the paper on it, and here is the section of my paper with my citation for why it's significant. So I think that will highlight your productivity in the sense that it will highlight that you're able to write papers in this field that's important to you. I will say that it's, you know, and this is a personal viewpoint. I think that at this point moving forward, and everybody please feel free to disagree with me, it's important to build a brand. So if TSC and PVIs are your brand, I would focus on removing yourself at this career development stage from projects that don't help you build that brand. Meaning, like, if there are more stroke opportunities, unless that can directly be tied in to this particular project, I would rather you like do like another TSC case report even than necessarily get more deeply involved into a stroke project. Not that that's not valuable in terms of your training, but in terms of like building your case in a grant. But it sounds like you have enough. It's just that you're kind of downplaying your own CV a little bit.
Yeah, I'd agree with Booma to a large extent. I think that, you know, I was kind of bummed that I couldn't draw a clear line all the way from undergraduate through medical school, residency, and fellowship of like unifying theme for my research, which doesn't sound like anybody can do that. But I could point to unifying theme in terms of methods. You know, I did neuroimaging of like older adults with vascular risk factors, no dementia, and depression, you know, for med school. Neuroimaging of, you know, people with congenital CMV in residency. So at any rate, I could kind of point to an arc there. You just have to kind of look at it from different angles, maybe get some input from other people like Booma, you know, another point of view, and just say, yeah, what is my arc? What is my story? I know inside how I went from A to B to C. How can I make people understand in a very succinct way that there's a clear trajectory, and a unifying theme, so that you don't have to play down parts that you think don't fit as well. And then, yeah, I think, gosh, I had another thought, but I don't remember it now. Yeah. Oh, and I agree with Booma that once you figure out what you're gonna want to do, at least for this initial part of your career, you want to focus your opportunities on that. So kind of building some momentum or a brand, as she mentioned, so that it's clear that this is kind of what you want to focus your energy on to move forward.
Thanks.
Yeah. Danielle?
Question to the folks that applied more than once. How much or how did your application change from the first time to the next time, in terms of proposing different experiments, or did it just reflect how your thought process changed over the year as you got more experience in the lab or with collecting background information?
So for me, I applied to those 4 different funding sources within a 12-month period for career development. One of them was sex difference oriented. 2 of them were, one of them was headache oriented and one of them was child development oriented. So there was some rewording to emphasize different aspects of it or the significance and background, but the experiment was identical between each of those applications. And then as I moved through those different institutions, I got input from different mentors too. So that changed some of the wording as it became more polished. But I don't think the design of the experiment really changed that much in any of the iterations. At least
Michael, you resubmitted to the K-12. How did you incorporate the comments from the first round into the next round?
Yes, so I paid careful attention to every letter in the comment and made sure to address all the reviewers' concerns to the best of my ability. Some of it was, some of it is just kind of proving that the experiment had some legs, and so that was obviously just going to take time, by increasing sample size and things like that. But parts of it were reframing the entire aim and just kind of, or adding an aim that maybe I wasn't trying to include, but so I was very flexible and very responsive in terms of trying to put whatever the comments were and address them and think about them really and take them to heart. What else did I do? Well, I used the old one as a map too as well. So, but I didn't necessarily, some of them things were the same, but really I think as you start writing it again, you realize this flow can be different or this could be better. And so I took more time to do it. So I had a lot more time the second go round. And of course that helps planning ahead, giving yourself lots of time to write and to really think about the comments.
There's an art to this. And I think one of the prior webinars we had, I can't remember whether it was Amy Brooks Kale spoke on it or there was another one. I just can't remember which webinar it was, but the response to reviewers is a fine line you have to walk. You can say to them, well, I don't actually agree with you on this, but that should only be in a situation where it's like absolutely crucial that that stays in the grant, if that makes sense. But it has to be done in kind of a polite sort of way to say, well, I recognize this.
Most of the feedback was spot on too, and it helped the ideas, so, it's rare that I got feedback that was like, oh, that's not good.
Yeah, but I don't have any data on how many people get the funding the second time around, but I know it happens pretty often. So you should feel like if you don't get it the first time, that's no indication you shouldn't come back. Yeah. All right, I think we're almost up to our limit, but any other burning 1-minute questions? We're gonna, for all of you, there's going to be a little bit of change in the format of the grant, I believe. I'll share that with you. I'm almost positive it's going to happen. We're trying to make it look a little bit more like the K08 and the K23 so that you can use it, the K12 as sort of a launching pad and somebody to review it so that it looks sort of like what you're going to submit for your K08 or K23, let's say. So that we're hoping that that will be more helpful to you in case, let's say you don't get it, you'll get our feedback and it'll look more like, what would go into the NIH. So look for that and look for the LOI. And I want to thank everybody for joining and participating. This is very, very helpful. So I hope that you found it helpful. Thank you, guys.
And
good luck.
Bye.
Thank you.
Feel free on my part
Thank you.
to reach out to the program if you want my email address, have any more burning questions.
Thanks.
Bye, guys.
Bye.